This is my first time over to the Mises Institute, actually, and it's probably long overdue, but it's been great to be here today, to have lunch with Mark and Joe and Peter. You know, it's been a real pleasure. Walking through the library out there is like being a kid in a candy store. You know, you want to just hang out in between the rows and purchase each of the books on display, which I might do afterwards, we'll see. But it's been really nice to be here, and I'm excited to talk about my work in development economics that I've been doing recently. This presentation will be pretty brief. I would like to split it up into three distinct parts. One part, which will be the briefest of all three, is just an autobiographical part, talking to you about where I'm coming from, what I've been doing, why I've been doing it. And then there will be a methodological part talking about where work in development economics fits in more broadly with an Austrian research program. And then finally, I'll try to show off what I've been doing a little bit by giving you a little bit of analysis from some recent field work. So that's where I'm going with this presentation, and hopefully there will be plenty of time for some questions as well. Now, to let you know a little bit about myself, I'm from George Mason University. I finished up last spring there, took a job at Mercer University. The last 3 summers prior to this one, I spent in the field. I spent 2 summers in the Czech Republic looking at the Czech privatization over there and just kind of studying how different Eastern European privatizations have worked out. And I've written on the Czech Republic and Eastern reform more generally. The last summer took me to Botswana. It was a chapter in my dissertation, and one of the things that I encountered quite often was you're writing about Botswana, but you've never been there. Do you really know what you're talking about? And to answer that question, I really felt like I needed to get there. I was able to get there. I spent a month there. I had 2 other team members who were there for 7 weeks total. And it was a wonderful experience that I'm going to spend time talking about today. The reason why we were doing this and why I felt that fieldwork was important has been really inspired by Peter Boettke, who many of you probably know. Some of you might know even better than me. He was my dissertation chair, and he's really kind of been pushing a research agenda that focuses much more on getting your hands dirty by going out into the field and studying problems at a local level, and then using the tools of economic analysis to kind of answer a puzzle or answer a question. There are many puzzles with Botswana that I'm going to talk about, and it was really necessary for me to get there, talk to people, interview people on the ground to start to make sense and form some answers to the Botswana puzzle. Now, methodologically, where does this fit in? We call it ethnography. We call it a case study approach to understanding economic development. If you're familiar with the literature in economics, it's moved more and more in the direction of using large cross-sectional data sets to try to explain development on a grand scale. You throw every country into a regression and then you say, this seems to be coming out significant, or we can't figure out what in the world's going on here. We can't reach any kind of definitive conclusions. Depending on what you read, you can get very cynical about what factors matter for economic development. In 1995, Gregory Mankiw wrote a paper that basically said we can't sort out what factors are responsible for development because of different econometric problems with the models. And there have been a number of other papers. Sally Martin wrote a paper saying, I just ran 1 million regressions, and he found a couple of things that do seem to matter. Instead of taking that approach and getting into that thorny debate, what we've tried to do, and a lot of this has been supported by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. What's going on there, and there are teams out doing fieldwork this summer. There have been teams out for the last 3 or 4 summers out trying to answer problems of economic development. We feel that the more appropriate approach is a local one where you go and try to explain economic development from the bottom up. And you could call this ethnographic. Professor Boettke likes to call it analytical narratives. Okay, and what we're doing is we're going out into the field and trying to get our story right. And from this very specific case, we can form more generalizable conclusions. The analytical narrative that we're relying on at George Mason University, the fairly Austrian analytical narrative, is quite different than 2 other approaches that you'll find One approach is a new institutional approach that basically involves reading some history and then providing game theoretic explanations of the phenomena that they've studied. If you've looked at Barry Weingast's work, Avner Greif's work, it's very game theoretic, and the history's kind of empty. All right, so this whole movement in our minds has been inspired in part out of a frustration that some of the economic historians aren't paying enough attention to the history. One other approach that has been used and relied on when looking at developing countries is survey work. You go out, you ask businessmen a bunch of questions. You say, what are the barriers to running your business? What are the frustrations you have? You take all of these surveys, you go back home, and then you run regression analysis on the surveys. We don't think that's exactly the right approach either. Ours is a little bit different. If you wanted to find some people who were kind of path breakers in this area, you actually have to look to sociology. As a sociologist named Dan Rose wrote a book. I'm blanking on the title right now, but he's talking about living in Philadelphia on the streets, like in inner city Philadelphia, okay? And he lived there for like a year. He became a mechanic and tried to figure out the problems of inner city life, the challenges that face people by going there and becoming one of them, okay? I didn't have the money, the time, nor the patience to go to Botswana for a whole year and try to become like one of the Botswana, which is the name for citizens of Botswana, but I did my best in 7 weeks, and I'm going to talk about some of that in just a minute here. So that's kind of broadly what kind of research agenda we've been pushing at George Mason University, and now for me at Mercer University. There are a lot of students that you'll encounter who are just getting out onto the job market or just getting out into the real world who have been involved in this field work at George Mason. The analysis I'm going to show you today, as Professor Salerno noted a moment ago, is based on this past summer's fieldwork in Botswana. The title is "Look, Botswana, No Hands: Why Botswana should let the economy steer itself." And I think from the title you can probably guess where this is going to some extent. Now, a lot of you probably don't have a clue about, know nothing about Botswana beyond it's in Africa. Maybe you know that there might be some elephants there and that they have an AIDS problem. Beyond that, many of us probably don't know much about it. If you wanted to know where it is geographically, it's directly north of South Africa. Okay, so South Africa is right at the bottom of Africa. Just up from that is Botswana. It's a landlocked country about the size of Texas, right smack in the middle of Africa. I should have brought a map of that, but hopefully you're able to picture where it's at. The reason why I became fascinated with Botswana is that for the last 30 years, give or take, it's been the fastest growing country in the world, okay? From 1965 to 95, it definitely was. A couple of countries surpassed it in the last couple of years. This remarkable growth has led people to call Botswana the Africa's best kept secret, the African miracle. 2 years ago, Matt Lauer from NBC went there and, kind of really boasted about how wonderful Botswana was. If Matt Lauer's going there, it must be kind of a nice place to go. And in fact, it is a beautiful place. I'm not going to talk about the beauty of Botswana so much as I am the economy and what was responsible for the development in Botswana. Going there, I wanted to make sure that the data that we were looking at in the West, in fact, was representing a true story or telling a true story. Is Botswana really the success that people have been making it out to be, or is the data somewhat misleading? Is the story just like a straight story of economic development and we should continue to bet on Botswana, or does it have some problems? After I went there, and just after a few days there, I realized that it was a very complicated economy, and I became, over my month there, quite pessimistic over time about Botswana's prospects for the future and frustrated with what they've been doing over time. Just to give you a little bit of background, it deserves a lot more attention, but this is a short presentation and a paper that I wanted to keep fairly short too. Botswana became independent in 1965. At that time, many regarded it as the poorest nation in Africa, okay? The British government, when they got rid of Botswana, just before they got rid of Botswana in 1960, said Botswana has dismal economic prospects that are based on hopes of agriculture, salt, and coal, all right? According to the experts, one of two things was going to happen. Botswana was going to become a heavily indebted country, or it was just going to be absorbed by South Africa, okay? Neither looked particularly good. At that time, Great Britain was really excited to just be getting rid of it, okay? They had no knowledge that there were any natural resources there. They felt like it was expensive to even administer protection to that colony, okay? So in 1965, along with many other countries in Africa, Botswana became independent. In 1972, they discovered diamonds in Botswana, and that forever changed Botswana's history. From 1965 to 1975, Botswana was growing at about 10.5% per year, okay? Now that doesn't mean much to us if we don't think about that number for a minute. If the U.S. were to grow at 10.5% per year for a 10-year period, we would go from about $37,000 per capita income in the United States to about $90,000, okay? Botswana was starting at a much lower point, so they went from like 300 to 1,000, all right? Still a pretty remarkable move, one that we kind of discount because they're moving from such a small starting point, but still splendid in and of itself. From 1965 to 1995, they grew at about 7.7%. From 65 to 2003, 5.1%. A lot of information that I'm throwing at you, but I just want you to know that those are remarkable, that's a remarkable growth performance over time. Anything over 5% is quite strong. We get excited by 3 to 4% growth in the United States. Botswana was achieving 10% for a while, 7%, now 5% over a long period of time, almost 40 years now. What in the world was responsible for that economic development? Going there and talking to people, there were a number of different factors. 5 of the big ones that I'm just going to mention rather briefly. Botswana adhered to something called national development plans, all right? These were 5-year plans that specified what kind of spending the government could engage in. Not like Soviet Union 5-year plans where, we're going to tell you exactly how our country is going to do for the next 5 years or anything like that. It was plans that were attempting to constrain government, okay? If you wanted to spend, you had to specify it, and after that spending was specified, you couldn't make any kind of amendments, all right? If you wanted to amend spending, you had to get unanimous consent of Parliament, all right? Pretty tough to do when you have 27 members that you're trying to get agreement on any kind of amendment. So at that 5-year point, you had to be pretty clear as to what exactly you wanted to spend on. Coupled with that was anything you wanted to spend money on had to pass an economic or social feasibility test. Okay, now you can think of making up some kind of story about how anything could pass a cost-benefit test. It was a pretty strict cost-benefit metric that they were relying on in Botswana. The projects that got first priority had to pass both the economic and social feasibility test. If they passed one, they received some consideration. Now, what would it mean to pass an economic feasibility test? You had to show that government spending was going to be profitable. Kind of tough to do, but they tried to show that most government spending could produce a rate of return. For example, when building roads, they had to show that the roads were going to get reasonable use. One anecdote that I can share with you while I was there, Botswana citizens are very proud of the fact that their first president was even constrained by the feasibility tests. He was asked, do you want us to pave a road to your house, all right? And it was like 3 miles of roadway, and he otherwise would have to ride down like a dirt bumpy road, and you don't want to ride down dirty bumpy roads when you're the president. He asked them, instead of saying, oh, of course, I would love that, he asked them, does it pass the feasibility test? And they said, well, not exactly, sir. You'd be the only person riding on it, And he said, well, then I don't want the road. And for his entire time in office until 1980, he had no paved road going to his house. He rode coach on the Botswana airline instead of like having, some kind of first-class airplane or, his own jet, which presidents in the Western world enjoy. Okay, things that were helping to constrain spending then had to have both of those tests passed in order to get financing. Another thing that was probably helping Botswana develop in that early period was they were very comfortable keeping their expats around at the time of independence, okay? They actually allowed the British to come to the table with them and figure out where in the world are we going to go now that we're free, okay? What should we do? In most other African countries, the first people to go and get the heck out of the country were the foreigners and the expats. They wanted nothing to do with the new government, and the new government wanted nothing to do with them. Okay, so in Botswana, there was much more of an attitude of cooperation as opposed to conflict between those two groups. When talking about the expats in Botswana, some of them would say the president would actually come and sit down with them and, like have Saturday night dinners. And it was just a very engaged, cooperative environment, something that is totally a complete departure from the trend when you think about other African leaders. Throughout most of the rest of Africa, they were putting up statues of Marx or Lenin at the time of independence, certainly not interested in any kind of Western point of view. Botswana had a different path. The reason, in part, why they had such a different path was just their president's attitude towards Westerners. He was educated in Great Britain. He married a white English woman, which was very controversial, but it certainly helped him develop a more tolerant attitude. If you wanted to try to explain why were they so different, I think that probably had something to do with it. Two other things going on in Botswana that helped them develop in that early period. One of them was they had no defense, okay? Basically, the way that they were handling any kind of conflict was they had a local police force that would try to put down any kinds of civil uprisings, any kind of protests. It was all handled by a very small police force. The attitude of the early reformers, we talked to a number of the more important people in that early reform period, was that the best defense was no defense, okay? Now, how in the world could the best defense be no defense? Essentially, what they thought was, if one of our neighbors, and their neighbors were complete basket cases at this time, okay? You have Rhodesia, and there's no question about that if you look at it. You have apartheid South Africa, you have Rhodesia, you have other nightmares going on in the West, which is now Namibia. At that time, it was German West Africa. All of these countries that, basically wouldn't have minded going in and invading Botswana. Their attitude was, if we arm, it's very likely that they're going to just try to come and conquer us. If we don't arm ourselves at all, somebody has to come to our aid. Okay, if we just put up our arms and say, we have nothing, you have to help us, it would be a huge humanitarian disaster if nobody came. And they basically, to some extent, were very good economists. They said, let's free ride off the rest of the world and hope that they answer our calls. Fortunately, for a long period of time, nobody bothered Botswana, okay? And in this early period, they didn't have to engage in massive defense spending, which certainly eased some of the fiscal burden of being a country. Final factor helping Botswana develop was just a general openness to dissidents and a toleration of foreigners. They were very comfortable allowing different humanitarian organizations to come and not only set up camps there, but in fact, set up full-fledged organizations. They welcomed foreigners from Rhodesia, later on Zimbabwe. They welcomed people on the run from South Africa. Basically, they took anyone who wanted to come. And you can look at old speeches, you can talk to people there, and it was just an attitude of complete openness, okay? They wanted these feisty people because maybe it was kind of good for business in Botswana. The feisty types might actually be somewhat entrepreneurial. Let's bring them here. Okay, so in many ways, Botswana was like the Switzerland of Africa. They were fairly neutral, they were fairly tolerant, and quite open. And by being open and tolerant, they certainly were able to develop much more rapidly. I've talked about their economic performance over time. It's not just dollars that they enjoyed, like increases in their per capita income. It also led to massive improvements in well-being. Illiteracy dropped by more than 50% over this period of time. Infant mortality was on the decline. Sanitation, access to sanitation improved tremendously. When I was there this last summer, I was scared to death to go to Africa. went and I met with a physician, and they load you up with about a half dozen shots, and you're thinking, this isn't good. The more shots that you get, the scarier it's going to be. And I got there, and they tell you, don't drink the water, boil all water, don't talk to anyone, get in your house after dark. All of these things that are really freaking you out. And we got there, and it was just actually a very safe place. It reminded me a lot of like a small Midwestern town. I'm originally from the Midwest. You felt quite safe. There was no sense of insecurity for your safety. You could drink the water, actually. It was completely all right in the cities that we were. When we went out into the more rural areas, we were a little more careful, but it certainly wasn't the place we were imagining it to be. Usually when you think of Africa, you have a stereotype like, probably not a place I want to go. And Botswana certainly departs in a big way from that stereotype. From 1965 to the present, they've enjoyed remarkable development. They've experienced huge improvements in their infrastructure, their education. Roads have increased from something like 100 kilometers of roadway to about 10,000 kilometers. The number of flights in and out of Botswana has been increasing. Things that we might look at to get a sense of general prosperity. All of the signs of prosperity tend to be pointed in the right direction. Over time, it's become a more service-oriented economy. Tourism's now a really big industry in Botswana, and they've done a good job of marketing it. But with all of this progress, there are some things that are pretty puzzling. Since about the mid-1970s, and I'm going to put up one little diagram here, since the 1970s or so, Botswana's government has been growing at a pretty rapid rate. And I'll talk about the rates of growth in just a minute, okay? So the data isn't real great here in 1965, but in 1965, Botswana's government spending as a percentage of GDP was around 23%, okay? From 1965 to 75, government spending was steadily declining, all the way down to about 12 or 13% around 1975, okay? Does anyone, by the way, know what government spending in the U.S. is right now, just to have like a general benchmark? Government spending as a percentage of GDP? 35%? Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah, I mean, it fluctuates a little bit, but that's pretty good. And depending on what you measure, some of us think it's like 50 or 60%, but yeah, we'll call it 35 and say that that's good. In Botswana, it was low, and for a developing country, this is actually depressingly high. But for the first 10 years, government is on the decline. The government that we measure anyway is on the decline, and Botswana is growing at a 10.7% rate. Around 1975, government begins a steady trend higher, and today government spending in Botswana is about 35% of gross domestic product. Some say that it's pushing 40% if you include a couple of other things that they don't include. What in the world was going on here in Botswana's history? What are we to make of Botswana today? I sat down with one of their finance ministers, and I asked him, I said, so what is the deal? You're this rapidly developing economy, but 40% of your development is government spending. Isn't that alarmingly high for being a developing country? He said, yeah, of course, but it's kind of hard to go back on it now. And he understood the logic of big government, which is a very frustrating cycle to get out of. I'm going to talk about what happened around 1975, bring us all the way to the present, and then talk about Botswana's future. Looking at that graph, between 1975 and 2003, Botswana's government spending was increasing at 10.3% per year. Okay, if you compare that to South Africa over that same period of time, South Africa was averaging 2.8% per year. So pretty rapid increases in government spending compared to its closest competitor and its biggest competitor. Okay, from 1995 to 2003, right at the end of the graph there, where you see another big jump, it was increasing at 8.3% per year. Okay. Think about the United States again to get a little bit of perspective on these numbers. W is really proud of himself when he can keep government spending fixed except for the defense and homeland security. All right. Botswana isn't even coming close to W, and they're saying let's increase it at 8% per year. Okay. It's pretty rapid for a developing country. Okay. Why in the world did this happen? Why was Botswana's government growing so rapidly? Well, around in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Botswana decided to establish a national defense. Okay, today the national defense makes up 15% of all government spending. Why did they establish a national defense? In part, it had to do with some raiding that was occurring throughout the 1970s. Remember, Botswana was open and very tolerant. They were welcoming dissidents from, South Africa and from Zimbabwe. Well, there were freedom fighters and other groups that were really ticked off that Botswana was protecting people that they wanted back in their home countries. They would come into the country and basically indiscriminately slaughter people along the border. Botswana said, we can't allow this to continue. The numbers were in the hundreds, if not up to about 1,000 people, civilians who were slaughtered in a lot of these raids, okay? Botswana citizens maybe rationally said, this can't continue. We can't allow this. We're not going to be able to do it all on our own just by trying to arm ourselves and shoot anyone who comes into our country. We want a national defense there to give us some kind of border protection. And they got a national defense that provides border protection and a lot of other things to Botswana. Today, the big controversy is whether Botswana should develop an air force, okay? A lot of the people we talked to were sitting there scratching their heads saying, why in the world would Botswana need an air force? Who do we have to fight with? There's nobody flying planes in Africa, let alone people to bomb, So there are huge problems whenever you start to introduce a national defense. And you have tremendous pork and corruption charges that have been surfacing in Botswana. Empirically, a lot of development economists have looked at the effect of defense spending on development and on corruption. Defense spending isn't a good thing for development and is a very bad thing in terms of the amount of corruption in your country. So not exactly good trends for Botswana. So from 1975 to the present, they go from 0% national defense to 15% of the government budget being eaten up with national defense spending. That explains a good chunk of the government growth. In my paper, I also talk about a couple of other things responsible for the government growth. Botswana, in a lot of ways, is looking more and more like the United States over time. And this isn't a good thing for Botswana, all right? They've decided that, maybe since the United States and Western European countries have a lot of education, that we should invest in education heavily. Today, if you want to go to school all the way through college in Botswana, you can. The big controversy is that you have to pay for your own books in college, okay? The government picks up most of the remaining bill for you, okay? A huge drain on government spending. They've also increased environmental regulations, labor laws over time, all things that make them look more like a Western country, even though they're a developing country. So they're losing that advantage over a lot of other countries. I have one other table up here to just show you. Wow, this thing is so nice. Instant focus, instant adjustment, pretty cool. This table is looking at education spending in Botswana from 1970 to 1999, the last year I have data for. This is relying on World Development Indicators data. So when we go into the field, we do rely on conventional data sources, but we want to back that up with a lot of interviews and information that we gather from the ground. Botswana's education spending over time has increased from 4 million current US dollars in 1970 to $450 million in 1999. Quite the growth industry, okay? Between 1970 and 1980, the rate of increase is 31% per year, and then it's leveled off to a healthy 11, 10% from 1980 to the present, okay? This kind of education spending certainly has been explaining, let's go back to this one, some of this rapid, massive increase in government activity. Okay, two other things that also have contributed to government growth. Over time, Botswana has had more and more interest groups developing, especially in the capital, Gaborone. Okay, one person that we interviewed said, "We've learned very well from Americans. The best growth industry here is interest groups." Okay, and I have that kind of information that I was able to acquire in interviews. And they understand that over time interest groups are going to increase, but they all basically, the logic of special interest government has basically been established. So you could look at that early period as a period where the slate was basically clean. And after some kind of early period where they could get policy shocks, in later periods, the government just took off with more and more interest groups. I talk about some of those in the paper. Over time, this makes the promotion of good policy a pretty difficult task. Finally, there were some changes in attitudes over time that have occurred as well, a lot of them coming from the discovery of diamonds. With this seemingly infinite resource, which it isn't, but the attitude there is that they have this wonderful revenue source. The attitude has shifted in the way that they view politicians from one where individuals are asking, what can I get from you, or what will you give me, instead of asking, what's best for the nation. So over time, there's been a general shift to a concern much more with like, am I going to get HIV cocktails? Do you promise that as a presidential candidate? Okay, as opposed to like, what's your policy on economic development? Okay, you can understand how that shift can probably be explaining part of that as well. So it's not just one factor that's been leading to Botswana's government growth over time. It's a combination of things, but the final result is big government in Botswana. I talk about ways that maybe Botswana can reclaim their post-colonial moment. I call this early period a post-colonial moment. I shouldn't put my hands on there. I call this early period a post-colonial moment where they've had a declining government, something we don't see real often in the world. Okay, government getting smaller and rapid development. Can Botswana ever get that back? I'm skeptical, but if they want to get it back, there are some basic things they need to do. They need to return to a concern with budget balance and smaller government spending, something that isn't a first-order concern right now among the Botswana. When we were over there, the talk was much more, well, you guys run big deficits in the U.S. What's wrong with us running big deficits? For the first 30 years, they've been very hawkish about never going in debt, okay? There's a very good reason for this. They're concerned that if they go deep into debt, they could become quite dependent on South Africa. They're worried about South Africa kind of going bonkers at any given time and them not being able to get imports in Botswana, okay? So for rational reasons, they've avoided debts for the most part over their history. More recently, with a shortfall in revenue from the diamond industry, they've said, it's not so bad if we run some deficits. It certainly would be bad in their case to be taking on deficits just because of the signal that reflects in the way that they've shifted their policy positions. Another thing that's going on in Botswana that would be nice to see reform on is just an end to the handouts for the private sector. Botswana has become very concerned with diversifying away from diamonds, okay? But it's diversification that's thinly cloaked as special interest handouts. Essentially what's going on is the Botswana government is now picking new sectors that they want to subsidize, okay? So textiles is something that they think that they could do very well at, okay? They're basically subsidizing the textile industry, which isn't making any money, but they say that it's, a way to diversify their economy in case they run out of diamonds. You understand the difficulty of picking winners or losers in an economy. For signaling reasons and for epistemic reasons, Botswana should get out of that business. And finally, there's a very strange relationship in Botswana between the state and the private sector. It's something that they call parastatals. A lot of other countries call it that as well. For example, the media in Botswana is largely supported by the government. So people are scared to ever come out and say anything negative about the government because they're going to lose a lot of their advertising revenue if they do. The government is in cahoots with a lot of the think tanks. You can't imagine how nice it is to have the Mises Institute that can say anything it wants about anything going on in the world and feel pretty free about that, okay? In Botswana, there are think tanks that are basically making sure to tote the party line and say just what it is to get another contract from the government. And there isn't the same level of criticism or, like engagement going on between think tanks and the government in Botswana. So it would be nice to see some kind of split or divide there between the state and the private sector. These are modest proposals that probably won't get put into practice anytime soon, but things that would be nice to see over time if Botswana is going to start to take the right steps towards smaller government. Just to wrap things up, I'm running out of time. to wrap things up, what are we to take from Botswana? I scratch my head. I think about this a lot at nighttime, all right? What am I supposed to say at the end of the day about Botswana? And the truth is, like, there are a couple of different things that I could say, all right? We have evidence here in the early period that smaller government, good policy leads to high development, okay? Let's not forget about that. You know, that, like, laissez-faire worked in Botswana in the short run, okay? We have evidence and we have some understanding of how government grew in Botswana. The way that it grew in Botswana is quite similar to a lot of other places. Mark and I were talking earlier today, and we said, you know, it kind of reminds you of that part in Star Wars where they talk about people applauding when liberty falls or whatever. You know, people wanted a national defense. People want support for education. And at the end of the day, what do you get as a result? A whole combination of processes and forces that lead to big government, okay? Similar story to our own story and to most other countries' stories. It's good to tell that story again, all right? That story never gets old for some of us, all right? Another thing you could take from the Botswana experience is the power of markets. At the same time that government has been growing rapidly over time, Botswana has continued to grow at fairly rapid rates, okay? The growth hasn't ended just because government has gotten big, okay? And depending on what day of the week it is and what kind of mood I'm in, I'm willing to tell any of those stories, and any one of those three seem pretty valid when you look at the Botswana experience. So this analysis is basically an overview of Botswana's post-colonial history. I think it's a fascinating history. It has a lot of implications in understanding the United States, in understanding other countries that you might be looking at, and understanding Africa's plight. You know, there are a lot of criticisms of African development approaches that are currently in practice. We can't have the United States telling Africa what to do because that would be imposing, okay? We don't want Africa doing it because they'll mess it up. Well, if they look at Botswana's experience, maybe they could have some kind of guide or like some kind of model when they approach their own development experiments in other African countries. The important thing for them to understand is they need to look at old Botswana as opposed to present-day Botswana. And I really hope that that, in fact, happens when different developing nations in Africa get serious about reform. Hard to say that it will, though. Just to wrap things up here, how does this all fit in with the Mises Institute, with Austrian economics? In my opinion, and I think I'm kind of speaking for Pete Boettke here too, in my opinion, this is an approach that's quite consistent with both Mises and Rothbard. You know, Rothbard apparently told a lot of young students, you know, who were looking for direction, what should we do? What should we do? Can you tell us what kind of project to work on? And he would say, I can't do a Rothbard impersonation like Professor Boettke can, but I'll try. You know, he would say, you know, yeah, go do history. You know, history's real good. And we're trying. You know, we're trying to go out there, and we're taking a unique theoretical approach to the field and coming back and trying to provide answers that really don't surprise us, okay? It's, you know, this isn't rocket science. You know, the conclusions we reach are ones that, you know, basic economic analysis should lead you to. But what's unique about it is that we're doing field work with theory. A lot of field work's done without theory. Like, let's go out there and just say that this is a unique experiment where demand curves, in fact, slope upwards, okay? That's not the way we're approaching the field. We have these lenses, you know, which you can call economic analysis, you could call Austrian economics. We go out the window, we look at the real world, and we try to make sense out of it with those lenses in place. And that's, in my opinion, how all of this is, you know, fundamentally Austrian at its core. And with that, I'll shut up. I'll turn this off if I hit the right button. And I'd welcome any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, and the like. Yeah?
You mentioned this, like, Western copycat phenomenon that's going on. I think it's pretty standard in terms of development stories that you hear. Do you think that this could change the focus of the direction for ethnography and field research in terms of looking at more domestic issues and performing comparative institutional understandings so as to send better signals as to what the benefits of Western civilization and commerce are.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got people like in the neocon movement,
Yeah.
like Fukuyama's new book,
Yeah.
which are propagating this Western copycat
Right.
phenomenon and encouraging foreign direct investment as a successful means for
Yeah.
development.
You're fundamentally our position on like neoconservatism and like Western impositions, whatever they want to send abroad, is that they had better know what in the heck is going on in that country. This ethnographic approach at its core is one that's saying, you know, let's make sure we have like the culture or the indigenous institutions that are going on, the stuff on the ground, right, and we have a good understanding of the history of these countries before we go and unapologetically, you know, throw democracy at them or throw, you know, like some kind of different aid idea. You know, you read the approaches that we've taken previously in development economics, and you just get depressed. You know, it's let's go there and produce shoes in this country, and what does it do? It just crowds out local shoe producers who were in fact making some money in that industry. And story after story is one where there hasn't been enough sensitivity to the local conditions. So I think the ethnographic message ultimately is one where you have to recognize that the people there matter, and it's one that's decidedly like anti-Western in some sense, but yet, you know, it is those Western institutions to a large extent that we would like to see established there at the end of the day. Let's see. Oh boy, Peter.
Scott,
Yeah.
let me follow up on Dan's point a little bit. In a more general sense, I appreciate the narrative that you have given us. I think your basic story is compelling, but I'd like you to help me understand better the value added of the ethnographic approach per se. Isn't obviously which parts of that story could not have been told based on secondary data,
Right.
Reports that others have made, World Bank reports and so on. What exactly is the ethnographic approach giving you that you couldn't otherwise?
That's good, and that's something that you have to have value added. Otherwise, you could do it from here, or you could do it from reading history books. I think what it's providing is it's giving you another source of like verifying what you're getting from your history books, what you're getting from your World Bank data. You know, you could. Pete Boettke calls it triangulation. You're kind of lining your story up and making sure it fits. Okay, you have your traditional history, you have your conventional data. Now you have this third thing that's making sure the other two things are correct. Okay, so for example, in Eastern Europe, we had data, which was all messed up. We have history, which a lot of it is all messed up. So we need that third thing to find out, you know, like what in the world is really going on there. And in those cases, you know, the ethnographic approach is clearly adding value. Let's get the story of like the local entrepreneur, you know, who's engaging in black market activity. Now, in the case of Botswana, what we were looking for in going there was to try to get an understanding of like what people there actually think about the current state of Botswana, what the reform process was actually like over time. You know, something that you can't get from like your traditional historian who's kind of biased in and of himself. You don't know what.
Could you describe it in a little bit more detail what you
Sure.
actually did?
Okay, sure.
Did you sit in the market square and just watch people for hours?
Sometimes, yeah. Okay, so what we did in Botswana and what we tend to be doing with most of these fieldwork approaches more generally is you do a whole bunch of research up front before you go. You read everything you can on the country. I had done research prior to this on Botswana, so that was easier for me. The two other people who came with me to the field did a lot of that, you know, looking at a whole list of historical sources. You get together, you formulate some questions. What is it we want to make sense out of when we go over there? And then you have to be willing to recognize that maybe the question you're going there with is going to change on the fly. We went there wanting to make sense out of how Botswana escaped something called the natural resource curse. That whole research program had to be scrapped because we couldn't get into the diamond mines at all. It was, you know, it's like, it was described to us as like Fort Knox. You know, the diamond mines are better protected than the President of the United States. So we said, you know, we've got to like figure out a different research track here. Now, what did we do when we got there? We lined up interviews with as many people as we could. We were able to get in the neighborhood of 35 interviews, which is about 1 per day for 7 weeks, taking weekends off. And that's a good total, surprisingly. So it's, you try to line up interviews with local citizens, businessmen, and then people in government currently and people who had previously been in government, okay? And then you ask them a series of questions. It's called, it's just face-to-face interviewing, okay? Now, one of my other people who was with me, one of my team members, was much more comfortable than I was at like going and just trying to absorb what's going on in the market. So he would go like off on his own and be doing stuff like in the market square and just like interacting and saying, I'm Andres, and I'm here to find out what you think about things. And he would be like sitting in a circle with people and doing his own thing. Now, I wanted more formal interviews because I wasn't all that comfortable doing that. But in the interviews, you're just trying to, basically it's a detective story, and you're trying to figure out, put the pieces in place as to what in the world has happened here. Now, you could get that from a history book, but as far as I know, I haven't seen a history that's really concerned about this growth of government over time and that can explain it without being there as well. You could just dig through the archives and maybe tell the same story, but that evidence wasn't there for us anyway. And even the archive work, you have to get to the university there or something. So I hope that kind of answers what we did and the value in it. Yeah, and then Bob. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the overall structure of the government and how it's changed over the past 30 years?
Sure.
A couple of times to affect time. Is that
Yeah.
where a lot of the revenue comes
Yeah.
from?
Yeah. 40% of their government revenue probably comes from the diamond industry. In the paper, I go into this much more in depth. The nature of their relationship with the diamond industry has been steadily, the rules of the game in relation to the diamond industry has been changing over time, and they've been renegotiating and trying to extract more from the government as they go along, and originally it was basically a 50-50 venture, De Beers and Botswana. It's called Debswana, all right? De Beers has control rights. They have some leasing rights where they're allowed to explore for a couple of years, and over time, the taxes on the revenue being extracted from the mines has been steadily increasing. So that tax has been going up to maintain a certain revenue flow to the government. We don't know exactly how that tax is shaping up, what amount of the profit is being taxed, because all of that is really closed, okay, and that information isn't there, but we know that it's 40% of all government revenue is from the diamond mines. Now, the structure of government, it's largely based on the British model. They have kept features of their traditional government in place. They have something called the Kagotla, which is an old traditional institution where they kind of sit around and discuss things and encourage consent, okay, and like unanimity before they proceed. And that's an institution that's fairly uncommon in Africa as well. So they're less hierarchical than a lot of other African countries. But the general organization at this point of the government is quite Western. The president has a fair amount of power. The Botswana Democratic Party has always been in power in Botswana. Just pretty standard government. Buck.
Can you talk a little bit more about the issue with the raiders coming in? For example, why didn't a Rothbardian defense agency pop up and protect them?
I wish I could have, done more interviewing along the border and found out if there were in fact Rothbardian defense agencies, or if it was just every man to themselves. I don't know. I would assume there had to have been some contracting out, of like somebody who was pretty good at like shooting, protecting, or like somebody protecting like a reserve. Along the border there are a lot of game reserves. Maybe they were more effective protectors. That part of my story I would like to do more with. But as far as I know, they were very, they welcomed the support of national defense coming out and doing the job for them. As far as I know, again, there wasn't a lot of stuff going up and down the river to protect against people coming across, which is separating the border with.
Was there sort of gun control there? Were there any legal obstacles to that?
No, not that I am aware of. Unless, there could be some kind of laws on the books that, the police force prior to the defense was the provider of security or something like that. But I would think that, if I would like to go back again next summer, and that would be something I would like to find out more about is, in fact, were there de facto defense agencies in place, doing the job, and look more closely at the severity of these freedom fighters as well. Clearly there were deaths caused by it, but was the motivation there? Was it the groups that were being harmed really wanting government, or was the momentum already in place for defense? And this was just like the final straw on the camel's back, Joe.
Yeah, when you said ethnographic, I expected a little bit more micro approach, in that I expected you maybe to investigate the cultural foundations of economic activity, the variation in the tribal attitudes towards economic activity, and in particular, the property rights structure, both among the tribes, and then how that was, in some sense, revived by the colonial experience. The colonial economic institutions that were left, in particular, the microstructure of markets. More like Soto, even the old Peter Bauer. I don't, how much activity, you use some statistics that I don't think I would look behind, I would look under. How much of their activity is non-market activity, of their production is non-market production, is household production. Let me play devil's advocate. It sounded quasi-mainstream to me. I mean, you did have more of an accent on these other things, but doesn't ethnography imply, let's investigate the cultural foundations? The key is property rights. That's what, and you never really said anything. Now maybe in your paper, it could be.
Not as much. And I really, in this paper, I try to deal with the post-colonial period to the present much more than the earlier period. I have an earlier paper that talks much more about the colonial forces and what was going on in colonial Botswana and pre-colonial Botswana. Now that was before I went over there. The truth is it was hard to get people to talk about cultural change over time or the different culture. It has been regarded as a fairly homogeneous place, in terms of just general cultural attitudes. There are like some of the old guard who are willing to talk about a change in values, but like deep cultural differences, like is there like a real entrepreneurial group that we could find, like that kind of micro story?
I mean, I know tribes are some more entrepreneurial than others.
Right.
Is there intertribal conflict in the sense, or envy?
Yeah.
The helmet check stuff. I mean, which can result in actual emulation.
Yes.
I thought we were going to hear more about that. I would like to hear more about that. Let's put it that way. I mean, whether I'm off base.
No, I think that's.
I think very important.
Yes.
For what you're talking about. I think it should also be focused on property rights.
Yes.
I mean, ultimately, the attitudes towards property rights, how they have developed and how they will develop in the future. These macro statistics mean nothing. I mean, it's what I think we want to hear is the evolution of these institutions and what your prognosis for the future. Yeah. Because that's where the progress will come from. I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, we were talking about wanting to explore the property rights structure there in much more detail. For example, one thing that, there are like huge constraints on time and getting something produced, and you're only there for 7 weeks. Now that's just like, kind of making an excuse. And we do recognize how important the property rights structures were. For example, they generally have a common landholding policy. So they're very comfortable with like allowing the tribe to live anywhere on the land, but then you have property rights over your cattle. Okay, and cattle for a long time has been like a really big thing in Botswana. Now, over time, cattle has become less and less significant. Okay, they're not. They're trying to move away from being cattlemen anymore, so it's become more of a hobby. You get out of town and you go to your cattle post. Okay, and you don't like live there and rely on that as much anymore, but there's stuff to do in that area without a doubt, and I would like to go back and focus on that much more. And there are a lot of tribal disputes that I don't talk about either between the San and you know, the mining company that, you know, have gone to the highest court and everything, you know, that, you know, need to be explored as well, you know.
Stuff with the legal framework, also
Yeah.
the participation rate of women, has that
Yeah.
changed? I mean, there's a lot of,
Yeah.
I mean, you could do a great study. I mean,
Yes.
you know, I'm sure, again, you were constrained
Yeah.
by 7 weeks, but.
I agree, and that's something that needs much more research. It's interesting. There were 8 groups there looking at different Botswana questions while we were there. So there's like this general like cluster of Americans all like kind of hanging out in the evening talking about who they've been able to get in interviews, what they're looking at. You know, and like one group was trying to come up with a general equilibrium model of Botswana. I'm sitting there going, I'm really glad I'm not in that group, but if I go back, I would like to be the property rights group, certainly, because, you know, one of my team members, Andres Marroquin, actually has been talking about doing stuff related to the property rights structure for part of his dissertation, too, because he was so puzzled by how that's affecting economic activity. You know, this commons with rights to the things that are mobile, you know, so it's, yeah, a huge question. Yep.
Related to that,
Mhm.
is, that concern is Rothbard introduced several critiques and innovations on the empirical statistics that he would use, and I was wondering if you would try to use any of his definitions or any other Austrian definitions,
Yeah.
say GDP
Oh,
or
yeah.
money supply or something like that. Looking at
I'm especially sympathetic to his stripping government from gross domestic product. I've done that. Actually, it's a different paper, but I've stripped that out. And when you look at like Botswana's development, taking government out from 1993 to 2003 or something like that, you know, it falls to around 2.8% growth from the 5.1% or whatever it was. You know, so I look at some of that because Botswana's growth miracle doesn't look nearly as miraculous when you look at just private sector growth. And then if you go farther and you like take out the diamonds, you know, and you say that that's like, I don't know, you want to put that into a separate category and say that's not real entrepreneurial activity. That's just like good luck to some extent. And you kind of take that out. What does Botswana have going for it? You know, the things it does have going for it are, you know, a really vibrant tourist industry. You know, it has some wonderful natural beauty that they've been able to really play up. And, you know, they have been doing some service activity as well, car manufacturing and things like that. So, yeah, I am sympathetic to Rothbard's, especially his notion of what exactly is it that we want to see in gross domestic product. And I've looked at that, and it diminishes recent Botswana history to some extent when you take government out, you know.
Okay, we'll have to end there.
Okay,
We're out of time.
sure.
And we'll stick around for informal questions.
Thank you. Thank you.